I cannot burn! Bishop Ridley screamed in agony as his legs were roasted down to the bone, yet his upper body remained completely untouched by the flames. This horror was caused by a tragic mistake. His brother-in-law had packed the wood too tightly around Ridley's feet, trying to help him die faster. Instead, he cut off the airflow, accidentally turning a standard execution into a slow, agonizing torture session. This was a brutal end for the man who dared to humiliate Bloody Mary by publicly calling her a bastard. Ridley had attacked the Queen's deepest insecurity, and she wanted him purged by fire. But fate had a crueler plan. Instead of a martyr's quick death, he was forced to endure a living hell, screaming for help while the fire refused to rise. Nicholas Ridley was not born into the soft, velvet-draped world of the southern English gentry. He was not a creature of the court, bred for whispering in corridors. He was born roughly around the year 1500 in South Tynedale, Northumberland. In the early 16th century, Northumberland was effectively a failed state. It was the debatable land, the rugged frontier between a hostile Scotland and a distant, indifferent England. This was the home of the Border Reivers, clans of riding families who recognized no authority but their own kin. For centuries, the Ridleys, the Armstrongs, the Charltons, and the Grahams had engaged in a perpetual cycle of cattle raiding, arson, kidnapping, and blood feuds. Unthank Hall, where Nicholas was born, was not a manor house in the traditional sense. It was a fortress. It was a vassal house, a fortified farmhouse with thick stone walls designed to be defended against a midnight siege. The ground floor was for the cattle to protect them from theft. The family lived above, pulling the ladder up at night. This geography is destiny. Nicholas Ridley came from a long line of knights and warriors. His uncle was a knight. His father was a man of the sword. The Ridleys were known for their hard riding and hard hitting. They were men who valued physical endurance, stoicism, and a certain grim humor in the face of death. It is crucial to understand this genetic inheritance. When we read of Ridley's intellectual brilliance later in life, we must remember that it was housed in the body of a borderer. He possessed a physical toughness that the soft scholars of Oxford and Cambridge simply did not have. He was raised in a culture where pain was a daily reality and where loyalty to one's clan was the highest virtue. As a second son, however, Nicholas was not destined to inherit the sword. He was destined for the church. This was the standard path for younger sons of the gentry. The eldest gets the land, the second gets the priesthood. But Nicholas was not sent to a local monastery to mumble prayers. His intellect was evident early on, a terrifyingly sharp memory, and a hunger for logic that outstripped his local tutors. His uncle, Dr. Robert Ridley, was a man of significant influence and a staunch conservative Catholic. He saw the potential in the boy. He plucked Nicholas from the mud and blood of Tynedale and sent him south to the glittering, dangerous world of Cambridge University. When Nicholas Ridley arrived at Pembroke Hall, Cambridge, around 1518, he walked into a world on the brink of a nervous breakdown. For centuries, the University of Cambridge had been the guardian of medieval scholasticism. This was a method of learning based on the intense study of approved texts, Aristotle, the Church Fathers, and the elaborate legalistic framework of canon law. It was a closed system. You didn't ask, "Is this true?" You asked, "How does this fit with what the Pope says?" But the winds were changing. A new intellectual movement, humanism, was sweeping up from Italy. Men like Erasmus were arguing for ad fontes, to the sources. They argued that to understand God, you shouldn't read a commentary written by a monk in 1200. You should learn Greek and Hebrew and read the Bible in its original language. Ridley took to this new learning like a starving man to a feast. He was a linguistic prodigy. He mastered Latin, then Greek. He would later be known to wander the orchards of Pembroke Hall, memorizing the epistles of St. Paul in the original Greek until he could recite them backward and forward. This act of memorization was not just a parlor trick. It was a spiritual transformation. As he internalized the actual words of the apostles, he began to notice the vast yawning chasm between the church of the New Testament and the church of 1520s England. In the Bible, he saw humble fishermen and communal meals. In England, he saw a church of immense wealth, political power, and complex rituals that, to his logical mind, seemed to have no basis in the text. However, Ridley was not a revolutionary, not yet. He was a cautious man. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who were hot-headed radicals, Ridley was a lawyer at heart. He needed proof. He needed to be sure. Throughout the 1520s, he remained a dutiful son of the church, even ordained as a priest. He went to the Sorbonne in Paris to continue his studies. But while he was in Paris, something happened in Germany that would shatter the world. A monk named Martin Luther had not just questioned the church, he had set fire to it. By the late 1520s, Cambridge had become the entry point for the Lutheran heresy. The port of King's Lynn was nearby, and merchants were smuggling in barrels of forbidden books hidden under layers of grain and cloth. There was a tavern in Cambridge called the White Horse Inn. It was a nondescript place, but it had a back door that allowed scholars to enter unseen from the colleges. It became known as Little Germany. It was here that the future architects of the English Reformation gathered to drink ale and whisper treason. Thomas Bilney, Robert Barnes, Hugh Latimer, these were men who were drunk on the idea of sola fide, justification by faith alone. Ridley was drawn to this circle, but he stood slightly apart. He was the skeptic in the room. He listened to their arguments, dismantled them, and forced them to rebuild them stronger. He was sharpening his mind against the whetstone of their passion. It was here he met Hugh Latimer. Latimer was Ridley's opposite. Where Ridley was cool, academic, and precise, Latimer was earthy, emotional, and fiery. Latimer was a preacher of the people. Ridley was a theologian of the book. They formed a partnership that would last until the moment they died at each other's feet. The question that haunted Ridley was the Eucharist, the Mass. The Catholic Church taught transubstantiation, the belief that when the priest blesses the bread and wine, its substance miraculously changes into the actual physical flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, even though it still looks and tastes like bread and wine. To deny this was the supreme heresy. It was to deny Christ's presence. Ridley, with his obsession for logic and his knowledge of Greek, began to struggle with this. He read a banned book by a 9th century monk named Ratramnus. Ratramnus argued that the presence was spiritual, not physical. For Ridley, this was the key. It reconciled his faith with his reason. Christ was present, yes, like the sun is present in a room through its light and warmth, without the sun actually crashing through the window. It was a real presence, but a spiritual one. This sounds like a minor theological technicality to modern ears. In the 16th century, it was the difference between being a saint and being a heap of ash. While Ridley was wrestling with Greek verbs in Cambridge, King Henry VIII was wrestling with his conscience and his libido in London. Henry needed a son. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to give him one. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused to annul his marriage. We all know the story. Henry broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. But we must be careful here. Henry VIII was not a Protestant. He hated Martin Luther. He burned Lutherans. Henry wanted Catholicism without the Pope. He wanted the Latin Mass, the celibate priests, and the incense. He just wanted to be the one in charge of it. This created a bizarre and terrifying political environment. You could be burned for being a Lutheran, heresy, and you could be beheaded for being a papist, treason. You had to walk a razor's edge of conformity to the king's specific, evolving, and often contradictory personal theology. For Nicholas Ridley, this was an opportunity. Henry needed intellectuals to justify his break with Rome. He needed scholars who could comb through ancient history and prove that the Pope had no authority over England. Ridley was perfect for this. In 1534, the University of Cambridge was asked to rule on the authority of the Pope. Ridley, as a senior proctor, signed the decree stating that the Bishop of Rome had no more authority in England than any other foreign bishop. It was his first act of rebellion. He had officially rejected the Pope. This brought him to the attention of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was the quiet mastermind of the Reformation. He was a survivor, a man who knew how to manage the volatile King Henry. Cranmer needed a lieutenant, someone younger, tougher, and sharper. He found Nicholas Ridley. Ridley became Cranmer's chaplain. He moved from the academic bubble of Cambridge to the shark tank of the Tudor court. He was now living in the shadow of the throne. By the late 1530s and early 1540s, Ridley was evolving from a scholar into an enforcer. He was given the parish of Herne in Kent. It was here, in the quiet of the countryside, that his heresy fully matured. He began to preach in English. He told his parishioners that they should pray not in Latin mumbling, but in their own tongue. But the danger was growing. Henry VIII was old, sick, and paranoid. The conservative faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner, was fighting back. They convinced the king to pass the Act of Six Articles in 1539, reaffirming Catholic doctrines and imposing the death penalty for denying them. Ridley was in mortal danger. In 1543, the blow fell. The conservatives launched a plot to take down Cranmer and his circle. They accused Ridley of preaching heresy at Herne. Ridley was summoned before the Privy Council. This was usually the end of the line, but Ridley displayed the borderer's nerve. He didn't panic. He used his legal training to pick apart the accusations. He survived, but it was a warning shot. He knew that as long as Henry VIII was alive, the Reformation could go no further. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last. The terrifying epoch was over. His son Edward VI took the throne. Edward was only 9 years old. He was a strange, serious, intense child. He had been educated by Protestant tutors, and he was a zealot. He didn't just want to reform the church, he wanted to purify it. This was the moment Ridley had been preparing for his entire life. The brakes were off, Ridley was unleashed. He was made Bishop of Rochester and later Bishop of London. He became the architect of the Edwardian Reformation. Now the new learning moved from the classroom to the streets. Ridley's vision was radical. He looked at the medieval churches of London, filled with statues of saints, rood screens, and wall paintings, and he saw idolatry. He saw dumb stones that the people worshipped instead of the living God. He issued the injunctions. It was an order to cleanse the temples. Imagine the scene in London in 1548. Gangs of men, authorized by the bishop, entering the ancient churches. They pulled down the statues. They whitewashed the colorful frescoes. They smashed the stained glass, replacing it with clear glass so the light of Scripture could shine in. To the devout Catholics of England, This was a cultural apocalypse. To Ridley, it was a liberation. But his most controversial act was the War of the Altars. Ridley argued that the Mass was not a sacrifice, but a communion, a supper. Therefore, you didn't need an altar, you needed a table. In 1550, he ordered every stone altar in the Diocese of London to be torn down. These were heavy consecrated slabs of stone that had stood for hundreds of years. They were broken up and used to pave the floors or build walls. In their place, Ridley demanded simple wooden tables be placed in the center of the choir. This changed the physical geography of worship. The priest no longer stood with his back to the people, whispering into the stone. He stood at the table facing the congregation, speaking English. Ridley was physically changing the way people encountered God. He was forcing them to look at each other, not at the magic of the host. However, Ridley was not a chaotic revolutionary. He was a man of order. He believed in the crown and the state. This put him on a collision course with the Puritans, the radicals, who wanted to destroy everything that smelled of Catholicism. The clash came with John Hooper, a firebrand who refused to wear traditional vestments, calling them popish rags. Ridley stood firm. To him, the clothes were adiaphora, things indifferent. They didn't save you and they didn't damn you, but the king had ordered them to be worn for the sake of dignity and order. To disobey was to disobey the king. Ridley and Cranmer actually had Hooper imprisoned to force him to submit. It showed the steely side of Ridley's character. He was a reformer, yes, but he was an authoritarian. He would not tolerate dissent from the Catholics, nor would he tolerate anarchy from the radicals. By 1553, Nicholas Ridley was one of the most powerful men in England. He was the Bishop of London. He was a close advisor to the king. He was rewriting the laws of God and man, but he had forgotten the first rule of the borderlands. Never turn your back on the horizon. A storm was coming from the east. In the spring of 1553, the young King Edward VI began to cough. The tuberculosis that had ravaged the Tudor line took hold of the teenage monarch. The Reformation was in peril. Edward was unmarried and childless. By the laws of succession established by Henry VIII, the heir was his older sister Mary, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a woman who had spent decades in the shadows, clinging to her mother's rosary beads, nursing a burning hatred for the men who had declared her a bastard and her faith a heresy. If Mary took the throne, Ridley knew he was dead. But more importantly to him, he believed the gospel would die in England. Desperation took hold of the Protestant council. They hatched a plot, a treasonous, terrifying plot, to alter the succession. They would bypass Mary and give the crown to a distant cousin, a staunch Protestant teenager named Lady Jane Grey. Ridley was not the mastermind of the plot, but he was its moral voice. He had to choose between his loyalty to the Tudor bloodline and his loyalty to the Protestant cause. He chose the cause. On a warm Sunday in July 1553, the fate of the Reformation hung in the balance. With King Edward dead and the city in a panic, Nicholas Ridley stepped into the pulpit at Paul's Cross. A sea of anxious faces looked up at him. Ridley took a breath, looking out at the city he had tried to purify. He knew the risks. He knew the stakes. And in that moment, he decided to throw the dice. His voice rang out across the square, delivering the most dangerous sermon of his life. He did not preach peace. He preached war. He declared that Mary and her sister Elizabeth were illegitimate. He warned that Mary would bring foreign powers to enslave Englishmen. He committed high treason in front of thousands of witnesses, staking his life on Lady Jane Grey. The words left his mouth, and he expected a roar of approval. London was a Protestant city. He had spent years purging its churches. He expected the people to rise up against the threat of a Catholic queen. Instead, as the echo of his voice faded into the humid London air, he was met with a terrifying sound: silence. The crowd dispersed in a sullen, anxious quiet. The gamble was over before the dice had even stopped rolling. Ridley realized too late that he had mistaken the silence of the crowd for agreement, when in fact it was the silence of fear. As the sun set on that Sunday, the shadow of the axe was already lengthening toward him. Ridley had gambled everything on the Duke of Northumberland's power play, and within hours he knew he had lost. The reports began to filter in. Mary was not hiding in fear. She was riding. She was gathering an army in East Anglia, and the nobility of England, Catholic and Protestant alike, were flocking to her banner. They were choosing legitimacy over theology. The 9 days' wonder was collapsing, and Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, was standing alone on the wrong side of history. Panic gripped the council. The Duke of Northumberland marched out with an army to intercept Mary, but his men deserted in droves. The councillors in London, realizing the wind had changed, frantically flipped their allegiance. They declared Mary the rightful queen. Ridley was left exposed. He had a choice: run or beg. A lesser man might have fled to the continent, joining the exiles in Geneva or Frankfurt. Ridley did not run. Perhaps it was his borderer's pride, or perhaps it was a naive belief in the power of his own eloquence. He decided to ride to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, where Mary was holding court, to throw himself at her feet. He rode hard, covering the distance in days. He arrived at the Queen's camp not as a fugitive, but as a bishop, wearing his vestments. He hoped to appeal to her as a subject to his sovereign. It was a fatal miscalculation. Mary did not see a bishop. She saw the man who had called her a bastard in the public square. She saw the man who had destroyed the altar she held sacred. He was not even granted an audience. He was arrested on the spot. His horses were seized. His vestments were stripped. He was heavily guarded and sent back to London, not as a prelate, but as a traitor. The journey back was a humiliation. He was paraded through the streets on a lame horse. The same crowds that had listened to his sermons now jeered him. He was taken to the Tower of London. The heavy portcullis of Traitor's Gate slammed shut behind him. The Tower of London in 1553 was a crowded, chaotic place. Mary's government was rounding up the ringleaders of the Jane Grey coup. The prisons were overflowing. In a twist of irony that only history could script, Ridley was initially placed in the Garden Tower, now the Bloody Tower. Because space was so tight, the jailers forced the bitterest enemies to share cells. Ridley found himself locked in with the very men he had displaced: Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, and Edmund Bonner, the former Bishop of London, whom Ridley had replaced. These were the titans of the conservative faction. Gardiner and Bonner were fierce Catholics who had suffered under Edward VI. Now they were on the rise, and Ridley was the prisoner. We can only imagine the conversations in that cramped stone room. Gardiner, the wily politician, likely gloated over the turn of the wheel. Bonner, a man known for his physical brutality and hatred of heresy, must have looked at Ridley with predatory eyes. Yet Ridley remained intellectually combative. Even in prison, he refused to concede. He invited his fellow prisoners to debate the Eucharist. He treated the tower like a university common room. But the dynamic soon changed. After the rebellion of Thomas Wyatt in early 1554, a failed Protestant uprising that sealed the fate of Lady Jane Grey, the tower was cleared of political prisoners. to make room for the rebels. Ridley was moved to the Devereux Tower. There, he was reunited with his true brothers in arms, Hugh Latimer, the old preacher, and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. John Bradford, a young and fiery preacher, who was like a son to Ridley, was also there. For a few months, this cell became the holiest place in England for Protestants. They spent their days reading the New Testament aloud. They prayed together. They fortified each other for the death they knew was coming. Ridley wrote later of this time, "We were never so merry nor so joyful as when we were in the tower together." It was here that they solidified their defense. They knew they would be tried not for treason, which was a political crime, but for heresy, a religious crime. Mary didn't just want to kill them, she wanted to discredit them. She wanted to prove they were wrong. In March 1554, the government decided to move the Oxford martyrs, Ridley, Latimer, and Cranmer, out of London. The capital was too volatile. The people loved Latimer too much. They were transferred to Oxford. They were housed in the Bocardo prison, a filthy jail located over the north gate of the city. It was a place for debtors and drunks. The conditions were wretched. They were separated. Ridley, however, was allowed to remain in the custody of the mayor of Oxford, a man named Edmund Irish. This was a house arrest, but strictly controlled. The Irish family were staunch Catholics. Mrs. Irish, the mayor's wife, was a formidable woman who hated Ridley's heresy. She would frequently berate him at the dinner table. Ridley, with his characteristic patience and charm, would gently debate her. He never lost his temper. He treated her with the courtesy of a knight, even as she wished him dead. Over time, something shifted. The heretic became a human being to them. He was kind. He was brilliant. He was devout. Slowly, Mrs. Irish began to soften. This domestic drama, the softening of the jailer's heart, played out against the backdrop of a national tragedy. In April 1554, the stage was set for the intellectual showdown. The Queen's theologians arrived in Oxford. They were the finest minds of Cambridge and Oxford, led by Dr. Hugh Weston. Their goal was to hold a disputation, a formal academic debate. They wanted to humiliate the reformers publicly, to force them to admit that their theology was nonsense. Ridley was brought to the Divinity School. It is a magnificent building with a vaulted stone ceiling that still stands today. The room was packed. The students hung from the rafters. The atmosphere was not one of academic inquiry. It was a blood sport. Ridley stood alone at a desk in the center of the room. He was pitted against a dozen opponents who rotated firing questions at him in Latin. The topic was inevitably the Eucharist. Is the natural body of Christ really in the sacrament? Does any other substance remain after the consecration? Is the Mass a propitiatory sacrifice for the sins of the living and the dead? Ridley's performance in the Divinity School is legendary. He was 54 years old, exhausted and under threat of death, yet he ran circles around his interrogators. When they quoted St. Augustine to prove the real presence, Ridley quoted Augustine back to prove it was figurative. When they cited the Council of Lateran, Ridley cited the Council of Nicaea. His memory was photographic. He didn't have his books, yet he cited page and paragraph numbers from memory. At one point, the debate descended into chaos. The Catholic doctors were shouting, hissing, and clapping their hands to drown him out. Ridley stood calm in the storm. He said, "I have never seen such a lack of order in my life. You sound like a flock of geese." His primary argument was subtle but powerful. He argued that if the bread literally turns into God, then Christ is being chewed, swallowed, and digested. He called this Capernatic, a gross cannibalistic interpretation. He argued instead that we feed on Christ in our hearts by faith, just as we drink the words of a friend. The debate lasted for hours. By the end, the Catholic doctors were frustrated. They hadn't crushed him. They had barely laid a glove on him. But the verdict was predetermined. On Friday, April 20th, 1554, Ridley, Latimer, and Cranmer were brought to St. Mary's Church. They were asked one last time to recant. They refused. They were formally declared heretics. The sentence was excommunication. The path to the stake was now legally open. And then nothing happened. For nearly 18 months, Ridley sat in Oxford. Why the delay? The legal machinery was jammed. Under Henry VIII, England had broken with Rome. To burn a heretic legally, you needed the authority of the Pope. But England was technically still in schism. Mary had to wait for her cousin, Cardinal Reginald Pole, to arrive from Rome and formally reconcile England to the Catholic Church. The heresy laws were not revived until January 1555. This waiting period was a psychological torture. Ridley sat in his room writing letters. He wrote his famous brief declaration of the Lord's Supper, smuggling the pages out of the window to his servant. He wrote letters of comfort to other prisoners. He watched from afar as the fires began. In February 1555, John Rogers, the man who had translated the Bible, was burned at Smithfield in London. Then John Hooper, Ridley's old rival in the vestments controversy, was burned in Gloucester. The fire was green and slow. Hooper took 45 minutes to die, screaming for more fire. Ridley heard these stories. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew about the wet wood. He knew about the agony. Yet, in his letters, there is not a shred of fear. There is only a steely resolve. He wrote to Latimer, "The fire shall purge us." In September 1555, the end finally approached. The Pope had given the green light. A new commission was set up to try the Oxford martyrs, led by the Bishop of Lincoln, John White. The trial took place in the Divinity School. This time, it wasn't a debate. It was a sentencing. Ridley appeared wearing his bishop's cap, but he refused to remove it when the names of the Pope and the Cardinal were read. He said he would not honor a foreign power that had usurped the authority of God. Bishop White ordered a beadle to snatch the cap from Ridley's head. The trial was a formality. They read his own words from the disputation back to him. "Did you say the Mass is a blasphemy?" "I did." "Did you say the Pope is the Antichrist?" "I did." Ridley tried to argue his case one last time, but Bishop White cut him off. "Master Ridley, if you will not be a member of the church, you must be cut off." On October 1st, 1555, he was condemned, but before he could be handed over to the secular arm, the sheriff, for execution, he had to be degraded. The ceremony of degradation is a chilling ritual. It is the spiritual reversal of ordination. On October 15th, the day before the execution, the Bishop of Gloucester, James Brooks, came to the mayor's house. Ridley was brought out. They forced him to put on the vestments of a priest, the surplice, the cope, the alb. They wanted him to look like a bishop so they could strip him. Ridley resisted. He called the vestments foolish abominations. When they tried to put the surplice on him, he struggled so much they had to hold him down. Then the ritual began. Bishop Brooks took a piece of glass and scraped Ridley's fingers and thumbs, the places where he had been anointed with holy oil decades ago. This was to scrape away the power to sacrifice. They stripped the vestments off him one by one. They took the chalice from his hands. They took the Gospels. Finally, they stripped him down to his doublet. Bishop Brooks declared him to be no longer a bishop, no longer a priest, no longer a cleric. He was now just Nicholas Ridley, a layman and a heretic. Ridley tried to speak, but Brooks put his hand over Ridley's mouth. "We shall not hear you," Brooks said. Ridley was handed over to the High Bailiff of Oxford. He was now property of the state. That night, the night of October 15th, the mood in the mayor's house was surreal. Most men, knowing they would be burned alive at dawn, would be prostrate with terror. They would be fasting, confessing, or weeping. Nicholas Ridley ordered dinner. He sat down with the Irish family. He was remarkably cheerful. His brother-in-law, George Shipside, was there, his eyes red with weeping. Ridley looked around the table and said, "I pray you, be at my marriage tomorrow." Mrs. Irish, the mayor's wife who had once hated him, broke down in tears. "Oh, Master Ridley," she sobbed, "I cannot bear it." Ridley comforted her. He spoke of the fire not as an execution, but as a bed of rest. He said, "Though my breakfast shall be somewhat sharp and painful, yet I am sure my supper shall be more pleasant and sweet." He was displaying that borderer's grit, the stoicism of the unthank hall knights. But he was also displaying a profound spiritual peace. He had fought the logic battles. He had fought the political battles. Now there was nothing left to do but die well. As the candles burned down, his brother-in-law George pulled him aside. George had a plan. He had visited the powder maker. He had bags of gunpowder. Ridley didn't reject the idea. He was a practical man. If the powder could speed him to heaven, so be it. He went to his room. He didn't pace. He didn't scream. He slept. The candles flickered out in the mayor's house, and the bishop slept the sleep of the just. But outside in the wet ditch opposite Balliol College, there was no rest. The hammering had already begun. The workmen were driving the stake into the Oxford mud, and the heavy carts were arriving with the wood that would end it all. The intellectual battles were finished. The books were closed. Now the story would move from the library to the slaughterhouse. The stage was set for a performance that would require more than just faith. It would require an endurance that no theology could teach. The morning of October 16th, 1555, dawned over Oxford with a heavy, gray dampness. The city, usually a place of quiet study and Latin whispers, was vibrating with a grim energy. The streets were packed. Lord Williams of Thames had been ordered by the Queen to bring a retinue of armed men to keep the peace, fearing that the students or the townsfolk might riot to save the condemned men. But the crowd wasn't there to riot. They were there to witness a tragedy. The ditch outside the city walls, the dry moat opposite Balliol College, had been transformed into a stage. A single stout post of oak had been driven deep into the mud. Iron chains hung from it. Piles of faggots, bundles of sticks, logs and straw lay in heaps nearby. For Nicholas Ridley, the waiting was over. The intellectual debates in the divinity school were finished. The legal wrangling was done. All that remained was the physics of fire and flesh. He woke early. He dressed with meticulous care. While Hugh Latimer, his companion in death, dressed in a worn-out frieze frock and a nightcap, looking every inch the frail old man he was, Ridley chose to dress like a prince of the church. He put on a black gown furred with velvet, a tippet of velvet furred with sables, and a velvet nightcap. He walked to his death not as a criminal, but as a bishop going to a synod. It was a final act of defiance. They had stripped him of his office in the degradation ceremony, scraping his fingers and pulling off his vestments. But they could not strip him of his dignity. He would die in velvet. The procession began. Ridley walked between the mayor, Edmund Irish, and an older man. As he passed the Bocardo prison, he looked up. He knew Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was being held there. Ridley hoped to catch his eye, to wave a final farewell to the man who had been his mentor and friend. But Cranmer was reportedly busy debating with a Spanish friar, or perhaps he couldn't bring himself to look. Ridley saw no face at the window. He sighed and walked on. Ahead of him, stumbling slightly, was Hugh Latimer. The old man was moving as fast as his age allowed. Ridley ran forward to catch him. He embraced Latimer and kissed his cheek. "Be of good heart, brother," Ridley said, his voice loud enough for the guards to hear. "God will either assuage the fury of the flame or else strengthen us to abide it." They reached the stake. Ridley walked up to it, knelt in the mud, and kissed the wood. It was a gesture of supreme submission, not to the Queen, but to the will of God. He then stood and raised his hands to heaven. Before the fire could be lit, there was one final ritual, the sermon. It was customary for a Catholic theologian to preach at the execution, explaining to the crowd why these men had to die. The task fell to Dr. Richard Smith, the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University. He chose a text from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. "Though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing." It was a cruel choice. Smith argued for 15 minutes that Ridley and Latimer were dying not as martyrs, but as desperate men possessed by the devil. He told the crowd that their bravery was nothing but stubborn pride. He compared them to Judas Iscariot. Ridley listened intently. He was a debater to the end. He was mentally composing his rebuttal. When Smith finished, Ridley knelt before the Royal Vice-Chancellor, Lord Williams. "I beseech you, my lord," Ridley said, "even for Christ's sake, that I may speak but 2 or 3 words. Lord Williams looked at him with pity, but shaking his head. The orders from Queen Mary were strict. No speeches. Heretics were known to be persuasive. "Master Ridley," Williams said, "if you will revoke your erroneous opinions, you shall not only have liberty so to do, but also the benefit of a subject, that is, have your life." "Not otherwise?" Ridley asked. "No," Williams said. "Well then," Ridley replied, standing tall, "I commit our cause to Almighty God, which shall indifferently judge all." The bailiffs stepped forward. They clamped their hands over his mouth to ensure silence. The debate was over. Ridley then began to undress. He took off his velvet gown and his tippet and gave them to his brother-in-law George Shipside, who was weeping openly. Then a strange and heartbreaking scene unfolded. Ridley began to empty his pockets. He had brought small gifts to give away. He gave a new groat, a silver coin, to a gentleman standing nearby. He gave away some nutmegs, a luxury spice he chewed for his digestion. He gave away pieces of ginger, his dial, a pocket sundial, and other small trinkets. The crowd surged forward. These were not ghouls seeking souvenirs of a dead man. They were believers seeking relics of a saint. People wept as they received a nutmeg or a handkerchief. It was a scene of profound intimacy in the midst of a public execution. Finally, he was stripped down to his shirt. He stood at the stake. The smith brought the iron chain. It was wrapped around the waist of both Ridley and Latimer, binding them back to the post. "Good fellow," Ridley said to the smith as he hammered the staple in. "Knock it in hard, for the flesh will have its course." He knew his biology. He knew that when the fire touched him, his muscles would spasm and contract. He wanted to be sure he wouldn't fall out of the fire. He wanted to face it standing up. Then came the moment of grim mercy. George Shipside stepped forward. He was trembling. In his hands he held 2 bags of gunpowder. He tied the bag around Nicholas's neck. "What is it?" Ridley asked quietly. "Gunpowder," George whispered. Ridley's face lit up. "I will take it to be sent of God," he said. "And have you any for my brother?" "Yea, sir, that I have," George said. "Then give it unto him betime," Ridley urged, "lest ye come too late." George hurried to the other side of the stake and tied the second bag around Latimer's neck. It was a desperate gamble. If the powder ignited quickly, the explosion would destroy the brain or stop the heart, ending the suffering in seconds. If it didn't, well, George tried not to think about that. The executioner arrived with a faggot of kindling, already blazing. He laid it at Ridley's feet. This was the moment. Hugh Latimer, old and frail, turned his head as far as the chain would allow and spoke the words that would ring down the centuries. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." The fire caught. On Latimer's side, the wood was dry and loosely packed. The flames roared up immediately, engulfing the old man in a curtain of fire. He cried out, "Father of heaven, receive my soul," and seemed to die almost instantly. He suffocated in the smoke before the flames could do their worst work. It was a good death by the standards of the day. But on Ridley's side, a catastrophe born of love was unfolding. His brother-in-law, George Shipside, was in a state of frantic desperation. He did not understand the cruel nature of the fire. He only knew he wanted to end Nicholas's suffering as quickly as possible. In his blind panic, George had brought a huge amount of gorse and piled the heavy logs high, thinking that more wood would mean a faster death. It was a fatal error. By packing the wood so tightly, he unwittingly constructed a tomb rather than a pyre. The dense gorse, crushed under the weight of the logs, smothered the flame at the base. The fire could not breathe. Instead of rising, the heat turned inward, creating a superheated oven around Ridley's feet while his upper body remained completely untouched in the cool air. The fire burned through the wood and began to eat his legs. Ridley stood there fully conscious, looking down at his own destruction. The pain was beyond human comprehension. The nerves firing, then dying, the muscles cooking on the bone. He began to scream, "I cannot burn! I cannot burn!" He wasn't begging for mercy from the Queen. He was begging for the fire to do its job. He wanted to die, but his body wouldn't let him. The spectators froze. This wasn't the usual spectacle. This was torture. Ridley began to leap in the chains. Witnesses described it as a macabre dance. He was jumping up and down, trying to shake the logs loose, trying to force the fire upward. "Lord, have mercy upon me," he screamed. "Let the fire come unto me. I cannot burn." His brother-in-law, George, heard the screams. He saw Nicholas struggling. George's mind snapped. He thought the fire wasn't hot enough. So George grabbed more faggots of wood and threw them onto the pile. It was the worst thing he could have done. The fresh wood completely smothered the flame. It trapped the heat even more tightly around Ridley's ruined legs, while blocking any path for the fire to reach his chest or the gunpowder. George Shipside was killing him by trying to save him. Ridley had now been burning for several minutes. His legs were almost gone, yet he was still shouting, lucid and terrified. "I cannot burn," he wept. The crowd was sobbing. Even the guards were turning away. It was a scene of such raw horror that it transcended politics. Catholic or Protestant, no one wanted to see a human being suffer like this. Finally, a man in the crowd, history does not record his name, only his act, saw the problem. He grabbed a billhook, a pole weapon with a curved blade used for pruning trees. He stepped into the heat. He didn't throw wood on, he pulled it off. He leveraged the heavy logs that George had piled up and ripped them away from the stake. Air rushed in. The chimney effect finally took hold. The fire, starved of oxygen for so long, roared upward with a terrifying sound. A pillar of flame leaped from Ridley's legs straight up to his face. Ridley didn't pull back, he leaned into it. He turned his face toward the fire as if it were a lover. The flame touched the bag of gunpowder. Boom! The explosion was small but effective. It stunned him, knocking the life out of him instantly. His body slumped forward over the chain, dangling like a broken doll. The legs burned through completely, and his body fell into the ashes at Latimer's feet. Silence fell over the ditch. The smell of roasted flesh and gunpowder hung heavy in the damp Oxford air. George Shipside collapsed. He had just watched the man he loved more than anyone else die, the worst death imaginable, and he knew that his own hands had prolonged the agony. George would survive, but he was a broken man. The execution of Nicholas Ridley changed something in the English psyche. Mary Tudor had wanted to show the triumph of the church. Instead, she had shown the cruelty of the state. The fire finally burned itself out, leaving only ash and the smell of charred velvet hanging in the damp Oxford air. The crowd dispersed, shaken and weeping, carrying the memory of the dancing bishop home to their firesides. But high above the city, the horror was not over. The smoke from the ditch did not clear for days, drifting up toward the stone cell of the Bocardo prison. There, an old man was watching from the window, his face wet with tears. This was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the architect of the English Reformation, the man who had annulled Henry VIII's marriage, and he was the last man standing. Legend says that from the roof of the prison, he had seen Latimer collapse and Ridley dance in the agony of the flames. He had fallen to his knees, crying out to God for mercy, not for them, but for himself. Cranmer knew something that the crowd did not. He knew that he was not made of the same iron as Nicholas Ridley. Ridley was a borderer, a fighter, a man of certainty. Cranmer was a scholar, a diplomat, a man of compromise. He was terrified of pain. Queen Mary knew this too. She had burned Ridley and Latimer to punish their bodies. But for Thomas Cranmer, she had a different plan. She didn't just want to kill him, she wanted to break him. She wanted the man who created the Church of England to destroy it with his own hand before he died. The physical war was over. The psychological war was about to begin. To understand the unique cruelty reserved for Thomas Cranmer, we must look at the personal history of Queen Mary I. Ridley and Latimer were heretics to her, yes, but Cranmer was the villain of her life story. It was Cranmer who had sat in judgment over her mother, Catherine of Aragon. It was Cranmer who had declared her parents' marriage incestuous and invalid. It was Cranmer who had legally declared Mary a bastard. In Mary's eyes, every humiliation she had suffered for 20 years could be traced back to the pen of Thomas Cranmer. Burning him wasn't enough. If he died a martyr, he won. Mary needed him to recant. She needed the Archbishop of Canterbury to stand before the world and say, "I was wrong. The Pope is the true head of the church. The Mass is real. My life's work was a lie." If she could get him to do that, the Reformation would collapse. The candle that Latimer had lit would be snuffed out by the man who made the candle in the first place. After Ridley died, the treatment of Cranmer changed drastically. He was removed from the filthy Bocardo prison. He was moved to the deanery of Christ Church, a luxurious palace. He was given good food. He was allowed to walk in the beautiful gardens. He was treated with deference and respect. He was visited by Spanish friars who were gentle, intellectual, and persuasive. They played on his fears. They told him, "Look at Ridley. Do you want to die like that, screaming in a ditch? You are an old man, Thomas. You cannot handle the fire." They played on his loyalty. Cranmer had always believed in the royal supremacy, that the king or queen was God's representative on earth. They argued, if Queen Mary is your sovereign, and she commands you to be Catholic, isn't it a sin to disobey her? It was a brilliant, insidious trap. They used his own theology against him. Slowly, the isolation and the fear did their work. Cranmer began to crack. Between January and March 1556, Thomas Cranmer signed not one, but 6 separate recantations. The first ones were vague submission to the Queen's authority, but the friars pushed harder. They wanted specifics. They wanted him to deny Luther. They wanted him to affirm transubstantiation. They wanted him to call the Pope the supreme head. Broken, terrified, and desperate to avoid the fire, Cranmer signed them all. By the 6th recantation, he was groveling. He wrote, "I, Thomas Cranmer, anathematize every heresy of Luther and Zwingli. I submit myself to the Catholic Church and to the Supreme Pontiff." It was a total surrender. The Queen had won. The man who wrote the Book of Common Prayer had just thrown it into the garbage. In London, the government rushed to print the recantations. They were distributed across Europe. It was a propaganda coup of massive proportions. The arch-heretic had folded. Logic dictates that if a heretic recants, his life is spared. That was the law, that was the deal. But Queen Mary was not operating on logic. She was operating on vengeance. Despite Cranmer's total submission, despite his groveling, she signed his death warrant anyway. She decided that while his soul might be saved by his recantation, his body must still burn for the sins he committed against her mother. It was a fatal political mistake. By burning a man who had already recanted, she broke the unspoken contract of the Inquisition. She revealed that this wasn't about religion. It was about hate. But she made one final demand. On the morning of his execution, Cranmer was to speak at St. Mary's Church. He was to read his recantation out loud to the people of Oxford, to confirm that he died a good Catholic. Mary wanted one last public humiliation. She was about to get a surprise that would shake England to its core. March 21st, 1556, a rainy Saturday. Cranmer was led from the prison to St. Mary's Church. He was a broken man. He walked with a stumbling gait, crying continuously. His face was swollen with tears. He wore a ragged gown and an old square cap. The church was packed. The Catholics were there to gloat. The Protestants were there to mourn their fallen leader. Cranmer was placed on a stage opposite the pulpit. Dr. Henry Cole preached the sermon, explaining that Cranmer had to die for the enormity of his crimes, but that he died a penitent Catholic. Then it was Cranmer's turn. He stood up. He took a piece of paper from his pocket, the speech the government had approved. He began to read. He thanked the people for their prayers. He confessed his sins. He urged obedience to the king and queen. Whatever the friars expected, it was going according to script. But then Cranmer stopped reading. He looked up at the ceiling. His voice, previously weak and wavering, suddenly became strong. "And now," he said, "I come to the great thing that troubleth my conscience more than any other thing that I ever said or did in my life." The friars nodded. They thought he was about to confess his heresy. "And that is," Cranmer continued, "the setting abroad of writings contrary to the truth, which here I now renounce and refuse, as things written with my hand, contrary to the truth, which I thought in my heart, and written for fear of death." The church went silent. "And forasmuch as my hand offended in writing contrary to my heart, my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be first burned." He took a breath. "And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrine." Pandemonium erupted. Lord William shouted, "Stop the heretic's mouth!" The friars rushed the stage, screaming at him, "You are mad! You are possessed!" But Cranmer was already moving. He didn't wait to be dragged. He ran. He ran out of the church doors and into the rain. He ran down the street, a 66-year-old man sprinting toward his death. He ran toward the very spot where Ridley and Latimer had died 6 months earlier. The crowd ran with him. It was a chaotic, muddy stampede. When he reached the stake, the wood already piled high, he didn't struggle. He stripped off his outer garments. He stood in his shirt, which reached down to his feet. He had a long white beard that touched his chest. They chained him to the stake. The fire was lit. Cranmer did not scream. He did not dance like Ridley. He did something even more terrifying. As the flames leaped up, Thomas Cranmer thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed the recantations, directly into the heart of the fire. He held it there. He watched it burn. He didn't flinch. He spoke loud and clear over the roar of the fire. "This hand hath offended, this unworthy right hand." He held it in the flame until it was burned to a stump, before the fire even touched his body. Then the flames rose around him. He looked up to heaven, said, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit," and died. If Ridley's death was a tragedy of incompetence, Cranmer's death was a tragedy of defiance. Mary had overplayed her hand. She had forced a weak man into a corner, and in doing so, she had given him the courage of a lion. By burning his hand first, Cranmer had created a symbol more powerful than any book. He had turned his moment of weakness into a moment of supreme strength. Queen Mary's reign began to disintegrate. She was plagued by phantom pregnancies. Twice she believed she was carrying a child, her belly swelling, only for the months to pass with no baby. The people whispered that God was punishing her for the fires. In 1558, England lost Calais, its last possession in France. Mary famously said, "When I am dead and open, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." But it wasn't Calais that killed her. It was the smoke of Smithfield, of Gloucester, and of Oxford. She had burned nearly 300 people in less than 4 years. She had turned England into a graveyard. On November 17th, 1558, Queen Mary died. She was only 42. Her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended the throne. With Cranmer's death, Mary's victory turned to ash. She had burned the bodies of the martyrs, but she had inadvertently cemented their cause. The story of Ridley's agony and Cranmer's defiant hand was immortalized by John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, becoming a bestseller that sat alongside the Bible in every English church. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne, she built a church that balanced the theology of these martyrs with the order of the monarchy. Today, the Martyrs' Memorial in Oxford stands as a testament to that terrible October. Latimer provided the prophetic voice, Ridley the intellectual steel, and Cranmer the human redemption. The candle they lit that day was never put out. It became the fire that forged the modern English identity. History is often told as a list of dates and battles. But the story of Nicholas Ridley reminds us that history is also biology. It is the failure of a nerve ending. It is the thickness of a log. It is the mistake of a brother-in-law who loved too much. It is the story of a man who danced in the fire, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And in that terrible involuntary dance, he stepped out of time and into legend. The candle is still burning.